Olá, vamos dar início agora à segunda edição do Upgrade Summit, com uma aula fantástica, ministrada por ninguém menos que Daniel Siegel, com a moderação de outro grande mestre, o Daniel Goleman. Aqui abaixo vocês conferem uma descrição detalhada do currículo de cada um, mas já adiantando aqui, o Goleman é simplesmente um dos autores mais lidos do mundo na área de inteligência emocional, considerado o pai dos estudos sobre o assunto na área de negócios. E o Siegel é professor de psiquiatria na UCLA, a Universidade da Califórnia em Los Angeles. Também é autor de vários livros e referência global na área. Antes de iniciarmos, tenho só alguns recados rápidos. Primeiro, se você ainda não está no nosso canal do Telegram, corre para lá. Além de acompanhar todas as informações sobre o evento, você vai poder ter acesso na sequência a todas as novidades que compartilhamos diariamente. Segundo, lembre-se também de se inscrever e ativar aqui as notificações do nosso canal do YouTube. Vamos agora à aula? A gente se encontra novamente em breve.
I'm Daniel Goleman, and I'm here in Santa Monica with my good friend Daniel Siegel, who's a psychiatrist at UCLA, and whose model of the mind and how it operates explains for me much of what I've been writing about is emotional intelligence. And Dan, what I'd love to do with you today is to run by you the model I've been working with for several years and have developed over maybe 15 years, and see how that fits with the way you've been thinking about human behavior, about life, and about brain function.
Great.
So think of it as a three-tiered building. In the basement is the brain. That's the black box that you're going to bring to the table. Above that are the basic components of emotional intelligence, and there are 4 domains of emotional intelligence. The first is self-awareness. The second is self-regulation. The third is social awareness, or empathy. And the fourth puts all that together in social skill, in how effectively we operate in our interactions and in our relationships. Now, on top of that, in each of those domains, and nested within each, are leadership competencies. And the leadership competencies that I've been using come from a very interesting source. There's a methodology called competence modeling, which was actually, one of the main developers was my mentor at Harvard, David McClellan, who was also a mentor for Richie Davidson. Competence modeling says if you want to identify a person who would be best at a particular job or role, what you should do is look at people who hold that position now or who have held them in the past, whose performance puts them in the top 10% by whatever metric makes sense. And then compare them with people in the same job or role who are only mediocre or average. And then systematically analyze what abilities or competencies do you find in the stars that you don't find in the average. And then hire people for those competencies, promote people for those competencies, develop them. In the last 30 years since he proposed this, this has become standard operating procedure in most world-class organizations. So most companies, particularly global companies, have competence models, particularly for leadership. And when I wrote a follow-up book to emotional intelligence called Working with Emotional Intelligence, I had access to about 200 of those models, most of which are confidential. They're proprietary because companies see them as giving them a competitive edge. But I was able to aggregate those models and to do a kind of back-of-the-envelope look at them to determine which of them were based on emotional intelligence abilities, self-awareness and so on, and which had to do with purely cognitive abilities. And then looking within that set of emotional intelligence-based abilities, which domain do they fall into? And for example, for self-awareness, emotional self-awareness, is a leadership competence that shows up in model after model. It's typified by leaders being attuned to their inner signals, recognizing how their feelings affect them and their job performance. They're attuned to their guiding values. They can intuit the best course of action. They see the big picture in a complex situation. They can be candid and authentic, speak openly about their emotions. So let's start with self-awareness. How much of your work on the mindful brain and so on has to do with the parts of the brain that are self-aware. So what are they?
So the first thing to say is I'm really excited about this opportunity to talk together. And I guess the one thing just to start with is, people hear about the brain and they often get kind of glassy-eyed and they think it's going to be too complicated. So I think there's some basic statements about the brain that can make us feel much more comfortable with it, whatever background and educational experience we've had. The first is to say that the brain is actually the social organ of the body. So everything that allows us to be social in some ways is mediated by certain circuits in the brain that we can talk about. The other is that your experience of awareness, just the subjective quality of being alive, has a lot to do with how you harness your brain in various ways. So for example, let's take self-awareness as your first question. When someone's aware of their emotional life, aware of, for example, how feelings affect their reasoning and their thinking, how feelings affect their ways of interacting with other people. We call that, as you have beautifully written about, self-awareness, one component of emotional intelligence. And we know, in fact, that there are circuits in the brain that allow you to be aware of your mental life that are actually quite different from the circuits that allow you to be aware, for example, of the external physical world. So, for example, when I was in medical school, I knew certain professors of mine could see the mind of themselves. They had self-awareness, and they could also see the mind of their patients. So if someone was given a really painful diagnosis, they knew to stay with the patient and take care of their feelings. Other professors acted as if, well, this is just a diagnosis, it's a physical problem. I'll give them the statement, you have this terrible diagnosis, goodbye. And it struck me that some people could see the mind and some people couldn't. So I use the term, as you know, mind sight, and I was very interested how people could see the mind and some couldn't. Both devoted to being good, in this case, physicians. So for self-awareness, we know there are certain circuits behind your forehead that literally make maps, and they make maps of mental life. And these are very different from the map-making parts of the higher part of the brain, the cortex, that makes maps of, for example, you seeing me move my hands, like this. That would be in the back of your brain. But these mind sight map-making areas are in the front of the brain, and some people have cultivated them beautifully and have self-awareness, because it's a learnable skill, and other people haven't. And some of that may be innate, that is, your temperament may make you more predisposed to having these mind sight abilities. But what some studies suggest is your experiences with your parents, or even the way you've adapted to try to make sense of the painful things that have happened with your parents, either way can generate the kind of reflective ability that self-awareness depends on. So in an organizational setting, a person who has that part of their brain developed will have all sorts of other aspects of brain function that are likely going along with it that we can talk about. But self-awareness isn't just, a person's contemplating their navel. It means they have the presence of mind to actually be flexible in how they respond, to be centered and know what their body's telling them. And there's actually neural net processors around the heart and around the intestine that inform your judgment. So, for example, a recent study just released shows that judges, when they're taking a person who's up in a trial, will be more lenient for the person up in the trial if it's right after they had breakfast, after they had their mid-morning snack, or after they've had lunch. And so when they've looked at this, your physiological state of your whole body will determine how lenient you are toward a person up in a courtroom situation. The same thing is true with moments of feeling threatened. When we're threatened, the brain automatically judges people not like us in a certain way and like us in another way, and those are threatening moments. if you're not aware of that as a leader of an organization, you may find yourself making all sorts of gut-based decisions that need to be more reflected upon before you act on them.
So over the course of a life, these competencies that distinguish outstanding leaders emerge. What's very interesting is that they all have a natural history that goes back to childhood. So if someone is a great team leader in a company, you'll very often find that they were a leader on a sports team as a kid. And that it's in the arena of life that we learn these abilities. You don't learn it in business school. You don't learn it in classes. You learn it in the course of doing it. And the brain, as you've said, is plastic. It continues to grow, shape itself, and evolve through repeated experiences. The way competencies are developed in a systematic setting through coaching and so on, basically has 5 steps. The first is to ask yourself, do I really care? Because if you don't, you may as well stop right there. Does this have anything to do with where I want to go in my life and my career and my job? Does it matter to me? The second is to get honest feedback from people whose opinions you trust, who know you well, about your strengths and your limitations. The third is to pick something that matters to you and develop a learning plan for it. It might be becoming a better listener. You know, every time someone comes into my office, I'm going to put aside what I'm doing and pay full attention and really listen. To do that, you may have to override things that you've done tens of thousands of times, which is because you feel pressured and you've got so many things going on. Person comes in, they start talking, you cut them off and take over. That's the habit that you're trying to change. So you get very concrete in how you're going to implement this learning plan. And then finally, you practice at every naturally occurring opportunity. A colleague of mine named Richard Boyatzis, who's at Case Western Reserve in the business school, has done this with his MBAs and finds that if they do this, they get better at these specific leadership competencies, the one that they work on. And not only do they improve in a measurable way, but if you ask people how are they on this 7 years later, wherever they work, you find that that improvement has lasted. It seems to be instantiated in the brain. Does that make sense to you as a strategy?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it's a whole way of, it sounds like creating a person who's proactive in life, using, even if they're not aware that the brain is changing, using the capacity to really be actively involved in learning and exploring and in all those different stages that you're talking about. Finding a way of inspiring people to connect their personal drives and meaning with their professional lives. Too often, I think, organizations separate them out and people are asked just to be like cogs in a machine rather than human beings on a mission.
Which de-energizes you. I mean, you know, you find a lot of apathy in organizations. And I think it's because there is a disconnect between those two things. What matters to the person and what you're asked to do. I mean, one of the most telling questions to ask someone is, are you having fun at work? Do you enjoy what you're doing? You know, do your motives align with what you're actually asked to perform?
Well, when you look at the brain and circuitry, there's actually a circuit in the emotional areas of the brain that's involved in playfulness. And play is something that we should maintain as adults. It actually promotes plasticity of the brain, it allows you to feel young. It engages very creative combinations of things that a company can really benefit from. So too often I think we separate work from play. So just in terms of that aspect of bringing the personal joy of playfulness into the experience of work, it sounds like it is not what you're trained to do, but it's actually neurologically a great thing to do. That's right.
And one of the very positive leadership styles is called the affiliative leader, who knows that having a good time together is not a waste of time. Because it builds energy, it builds social capital, emotional capital, and it, as you say, it brings this part of the brain alive. Why is that part of the brain so important?
Well, you know, a couple of reasons. First of all, play is associated with a release of dopamine, so it's very rewarding. So just by sheer neurological chemistry, you've got a reward system going. The second thing is there's another related area, which is basically exploration. You know, with play, we create new combinations of things, and that is really, really rewarding.
This is where innovation comes from. This is the moment. This allows for creativity to emerge then.
Absolutely.
Which every company needs if it's going to be alive in 5 years or
well, you know, if you play this out, I mean, no pun intended, if you really play with this, you can see, okay, if you become familiar with something and it becomes a routine, you develop that skill, you do it over and over and over again, okay, I know how to do it, that's my job. That's a non-playful approach to work. That person can become very efficient, but becomes dead. Anything that's routinized, that's repeated just like that, it doesn't have any sense of creativity. It's literally repeating the same thing over and over and over again. So for innovation, you really want to have people step out of the familiar and take joy in making new combinations. And that's something that requires vulnerability. A person has to feel like they're in an environment which respects that when you step out of the familiar, you're really going into territory where it may not work out, and that's okay. A teacher, for example, in a school setting, needs to create an environment in the classroom where kids feel that they can make mistakes, that it's okay to explore new ways of combining knowledge. That's how learning happens. I think an organization, a company, really needs to create the same kind of positive attitude toward innovation and exploration.
It's interesting. Two of the leadership styles that have very negative effect on climate are kind of the command and control leader, just, you know, do it because I'm the boss and I say so. And the other is what's called a pace setter, who's often someone with a very high internal standard for performance, high achiever in their early career as a solitary performer on their own, and that's because they drive themselves. Then when they become the boss, they don't draw on any of their leadership styles. They lead by example, do it the way I do. And they look at other people through this same internal lens of excellence. And they only give F's, not A's, because they're judging them all the time. Does that make sense from a brain point of view?
I think it does make sense from the brain point of view. One way is that we have the ability to just be inwardly focused and say, you have to do it my way. Now what that does is it lacks in the interaction a sense of empathy. The other person does not feel understood. They don't feel felt by the other person, that is, that their feelings are really respected. And the outcome of that is a sense of disconnection, sometimes even despair, and a feeling of disappointment.